Sorry, I'm looking outside, and there is the rest of the Vaughn family is trying to come in, but they have been greeted by a massive chocolate lab. So they're kind of stuck because they don't want to come in because the dog's there. They don't know who the dog belongs to. So you never know, right? I don't think that's actually the first time that dog has been there. Oddly enough, I remember Lexi calling me one night. She was here for youth, and I think that was the same dog. It was a friendly dog, but it kind of hampered plans for what could or couldn't happen with youth group. I thought of this idea this week as we continue in the Abide series. I thought of this idea that says proximity is powerful. That there's a strain of thought, and there's this idea that the closer we are to something, the more powerful or the more exciting or the better it is. Now take, for example, concerts, right? Some of the most expensive seats in concerts are front row seats, right? And there's this idea associated with it that if I can be as close as possible to whoever this musical person is or this band, it really transforms this experience. The experience and what I'm going to have happen is going to be more powerful. Think of sporting events. Some of the most expensive seats for sporting events are courtside, right? I remember a time when we, for some reason, some way, we got right up next to the ice for a Blues game. And the Blues were playing the LA Kings at the time. And I remember that vividly because on the ice level, the people that seemed so small and athletic on TV were massive giants. Remember this all-star defenseman named Rob Blake. He played for the Kings and the Sharks throughout his entire career. Rob Blake is 6 feet 4 inches tall. Okay, so he's right around my height, probably just a little bit taller than me. On skates, that means he's around 6'8". Okay, and he averaged anywhere between 220 and 250 pounds his entire career. He's not a small guy. And I remember he was frustrated once, and I was like, he's skating towards me. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's Rob Blake. And in frustration, he takes his stick and slaps it as hard as he can, breaking it on the plexiglass right in front of my face. Now that was a transformative experience. That was more powerful than any experience I ever had watching a hockey game on television. It's almost like this law of magnetic attraction, right? The closer we get to something, the more drawn we are to it, right? And we have all met people like that in our lives. We say they just kind of have this magnetic personality. We're just drawn to them. We want to spend time with them. We want to be around with them. And there's this idea that says the closer we get to them, the more powerful or the better or the more exciting that this thing is going to be. And we see that not only in our world, but we read that all throughout the Gospels with Jesus' life, right? That as he moved and walked and did things in this world, he constantly attracted groups and crowds of people. They came to see the miracles. They came to hear the teaching. They came to see this man who said, I am the Son of God. They came to see this person who said, hey, you don't have to wait for the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God is here now. And people wanted to simply be around him because proximity was powerful. The closer they could get to this thing that was happening, the more likely something good was going to happen in their lives. I mean, just listen to these words in John chapter 12. He said, many people, because they had heard that he had given these miraculous signs, went out to meet him in John chapter 12. So the Pharisees said to one another, "See, this is going nowhere. Look, the entire world has gone after him." In John chapter 12, it's this beautiful moment where Jesus' popularity is almost at its peak. He could not go anywhere without drawing a group of people. There are moments we read in the Gospels where he has to send the boat away from the shore because the people were just crowding around him so much. People were coming from all over just to see and hear all of these amazing things that have happened over the past 3 years. Even in the paragraph after this, in John chapter 12, it says that even Greeks came to this festival and were asking Philip to say, "Hey, we want to meet Jesus." People that had this pantheon of other gods, people that didn't even like or know or begin to realize had this thing happening, and they just simply wanted to be a part of it. It's kind of similar to people that are fair weather fans, but the team starts to do really, really good, right? Now all of a sudden they're doing anything to get tickets. Why? Because they follow the game so closely? No, it's not because they follow the game so closely. It's because this powerful thing is happening and they just simply want to be around it. See, because proximity can be powerful. And we see this in Jesus' life. But in John chapter 12, not only do we see Jesus' popularity at its peak, we see his problems at a peak. And there's one problem in particular with Jesus' popularity. It's this fact that right after that, after this triumphal entry, as we read about in John chapter 12, Jesus is no longer going to be physically present with his people. It's almost like a person that is reaching the peak of stardom, and all of a sudden, all of their shows are canceled. Or a person who's reaching stardom and their life is cut too short. Directly after we read this idea that even Greeks are saying, "I want to meet this guy," Jesus tells those closest to him that my time here is done. That I'm no longer going to be physically present with you. That the physical proximity that was so powerful and so transformative, all these things that you learned, all these things that you saw, everything that was a part of this collective experience that you were just drawn to, it's not going to happen physically anymore. It's almost like you moved from front stage or courtside seats to outside seats. And in these chapters, Jesus knows that this is hard for them to understand. Jesus knows that this isn't something that they can really comprehend, so he tries to comfort them because proximity is powerful, right? So in John 13, we read of Jesus washing the disciples' feet. That in the last moment that he has with them, he wants to comfort them. He wants to make sure that they're okay, and he washes their feet for them. In addition to that, he gives them something to help them carry on. So he gives them this new command. He says, "I want you, this new command I'm going to give you, it's to love other people the way that I have loved you. And this, above everything else that I've taught you or that you've seen or that you've heard, this is the way the world is going to know that you are my disciples." One of the only things in all four Gospels where Jesus says, "Hey, this is how the world is going to know who you are." I want to pause for a moment there because this, I want us to understand how powerful this is. In that world, when people followed a teacher or a rabbi, they literally, physically followed a teacher or a rabbi. There's kind of this saying that goes with it, that if you were a good student, you would be literally covered in the dust of your rabbi. That no matter where he went, you followed him. When he slept, you slept. Where he ate, you ate. You watched and learned and did everything following that person. You tried to memorize his teachings. You tried to follow in his footsteps so no one day you yourself could be a teacher. Jesus doesn't point to his teachings. Jesus doesn't point to his miracles. Jesus doesn't point to anything else. He says, you want the world to know that you followed me? It looks like loving others the way that I have loved you. And I thought about that this week. Because increasingly, there are a number of people in younger generations that are deconstructing their faith. I had a youth student reach out to me. Former youth student. He was a missionary for Casas por Christos for years, and he just came back to the States. And he says, John, I just don't know what to think about things. So I read some articles. I listened to other people that are kind of in the same place of trying to make sense of their faith as an adult. That was so much a part of their life as a child that when it came to being an adult, they just had questions. They didn't understand. It didn't look the same. There was things that didn't necessarily add up for them. And one of the things that is consistent throughout all the articles and all the people that I've listened to that have talked about this is this idea that what Christianity teaches with Jesus is vastly different than what they have seen or experienced in their life. That when Jesus says, go out and love other people the way that I love you, that's great, but it's always nuanced, or it doesn't look the same, or it turns into this weird thing, and it's disheartening. And I think that's part of the reason why we see younger generations highly increased in spirituality, but decreased in wanting to be affiliated with any organized type of religion or anything like that. Jesus continues to try to comfort them and talk about proximity, and he comforts them, and he tells them that there's going to be a place for them. He says, listen, you're not going to be alone. I'm going to go with my Father. I'm going to have this place for you. And in addition to that, I'm going to send my Holy Spirit as a helper to you. So you're not going to be alone. And Jesus is there telling them these words. And in John 15, he says something powerful. And I want us to read this together. So John 15, and we're going to read verses 1 through 4. Here's what he says, or this is what John records Jesus saying. Jesus says, John 15, verse 1, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while pruning every branch that does bear fruit, to make it more fruitful. You are already clean because of the words that I have spoken to you. And he did this earlier in John 13 when he was washing their feet, okay? Remain or abide in me, and I will remain or abide in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself, nor can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. In this moment, what Jesus is doing is a couple of things. He's solidifying who he is. Now, the vine and the gardener imagery was powerful for people that grew up in a Jewish household. It was kind of like God is the gardener and the vine is his life source that he extends. So when Jesus says, I am the vine, it's solidifying that he himself is the life source in what God is currently doing in the world right here and right now. And he points to God the Father and said, he is the gardener. He's the one that's making every ounce of this possible. And he says, if you want to not be a part of this vine, you are not going to be able to produce fruit. But if you are, God is going to continue to refine you and work in your life and be present to a degree that you are going to bear more fruit. So he solidifies who he is, and he again offers this choice, right? He says, I want you to remain in me, and I, in return, will remain in you. This symbiotic relationship. But it's tough. In a manner of speaking, imagine following something so closely for 3 years. And then hearing the words, I'm not going to physically be here anymore. So things are going to change. They are not going to remain the same. Jesus says, I'm going to go with the Father, and it is my time, and I'm not going to be here with you anymore. But what I want you to do in this moment is to abide in me. They had no framework or understanding to know what that meant. Their entire lives, the examples that they have been given, was this idea that if there was a teacher or a leader, you followed him physically until he died. And the person who was the top, they took over from there. Now you have somebody to say, I am what God is doing in this world, and I'm not going to be here anymore, but I want you to abide in me. And how is that going to work? It was this totally new conception and idea that they had absolutely no framework to understand because they have never heard or seen anything like that in the world. It's almost like teachers, when I was taking math class, to say, you are not always going to have a calculator in your pocket. This is why you need to memorize these things. You're like, yes, absolutely. I'm not going to carry this thing with me. They had no framework to understand what could possibly be in our pockets at this day and age, right? It just could not be fathomed at that point. This quote from Bob Goff challenged me this week. I was reading my devotional reading, and here's what it says. He says, we can't be a new creation if everything remains the same. What Jesus was doing in this world was only possible through the cross. And while everybody had this idea and this conception to say, no, we're going to be next to this powerful thing. We want to be physically present and within an approximation of what God is doing here on earth. We want to be around it because proximity is powerful. And what he did in the world was powerful, and he built this following, but things were going to change. The disciples were no longer going to be able to physically follow Jesus. They can't go where he's going. He told them this, but again, it's like me telling a teacher back in math class, I will have a cell phone in my pocket that I can do everything you're doing a lot easier. And it has a calculator, by the way. How do you think she would have responded to me? Probably given me another detention because I deserved it. Okay? He's doing something new. Rather than encouraging his followers to say, I want you to keep following me at these things, he invites them to abide in him. And there's a little bit of nuance there that I've thought about for the past couple of weeks. People were used to physically following Jesus at different distances. But now what Jesus is inviting them to do is instead of following him physically, that he's inviting them to abide in him, to remain in him. And how do we do that when he's not physically there? There's this idea that challenges us. There's this idea that says proximity does not equal intimacy. Jesus' initial call was to invite people to follow him, but then that call transformed to invite people to go a step further and abide in him. If I have a toolbox filled with $10,000 worth of tools in my house, I have a proximity to that, right? And it's powerful because those tools make me capable of doing different things, right? Doesn't mean I do them well. Just means I have the power and the capability to learn how to do something with them, right? But just because I have proximity to that, it doesn't mean that I actually physically know how to use the tools well. It doesn't. If I have that toolbox and I never open it, I have proximity, but I don't have intimacy, right? It's like Len growing up on a farm. He had proximity to farm implements. Proximity for tools that would make him capable of farming. But what if he never learned how to use them? What if he never took the time to abide or remain in this sphere and learn how to do that? He had proximity, didn't he? But does that mean that he had intimacy in terms of knowledge of what to do with the tools? We see this all the time in relationships, right? You can have two people that live, work, and breathe together almost every single moment of their lives. They lay next to each other in bed, but does that mean they have an intimately close relationship? Unfortunately, the answer is no. What Jesus, I think, is trying to promote and highlight is this idea. I want you to do more than just follow me. Because again, you can have proximity to me. You can own a Bible. You can memorize different things. You can come to church physically on a Sunday morning. You can participate in different things. You can do all of these different things, but it does not equal this intimate, deep relationship with me. And how do we know that's true? Because we see the person of Judas, right? Who saw and walked and did everything with them, but just because he had this close proximity to the power and these amazing things that was happening in the world, it did not mean that he had this intimate, deep relationship with Jesus, right? So what Jesus is inviting all of us to do is this idea to say, listen, I am the vine. There is no other life source that you are going to see in this world other than what God is doing right here and right now. And my Father is the gardener. It is his world and it is his garden. And he's extended this lifeline out to every single person. And I'm inviting you to move from this proximity relationship to an intimate relationship. I want you to remain on the vine because then you are going to produce fruit. And for those of you who think proximity is enough, that think you can be a fan from the sidelines or think you can be a mechanic because you own the tools, or you can be a farmer because you own a John Deere hat, you will not produce fruit. You simply will not do that. Abide in me. Remember the definition that we looked at? To remain, to stay, to continue. A person who chooses not to leave a certain sphere or area, they want and is inviting them to stay in Jesus. And the key to that is the spiritual relationship that he says, listen, I'm not going to be with you physically, but I am leaving you my comforter, my spirit. A little bit later on, he says, if you remain in me, this is going to be your source of joy. This is the way that you're going to bear fruit. This is the way that when you talk to me, these lines of communication are going to be answered, because you're not a vine from the outside looking in. You're not on the Louise. You're not on the sidelines. You're not in the cheap seats trying to yell at me. You have this intimate relationship, and we are close together. Earlier this week, I was reading Malachi Chapter 3. I have this devotional reading I have a Psalm, an Old Testament, and a New Testament reading. And as I was reading Malachi Chapter 3, it talked a lot about this refiner and what he was going to do. And I continued to think about this. It talked about the refining of metals, right? You have this metal, but you refine it to get all the impurities out. You refine it to make it more valuable than when it is in its original state, right? And I've thought about this. In order to do his job, the refiner actually has to have the metals in his presence, right? Can a refiner refine a metal if the metal isn't close to him? Well, the answer is no, right? It's like me trying to start my barbecue grill right now. It's just not going to work. Can a refiner refine metals that have been promised to him but have never been delivered? If somebody says, hey, listen, all of this is yours to do what you want to with, but they always stay within a 2-mile radius of the refiner, as much as that refiner would love to make those metals more valuable, to remove the impurities, to make them worth something, he cannot physically do it, right? If somebody says, all of this is yours, but never brings the metals into the presence of the refiner, it's never going to work. God has given us the choice to abide. Much like Moses laid out in the very beginning of the series in Deuteronomy 28, right? He says, I'm setting these choices before you, and I want you to choose life. We have the choice to abide. We have the choice to enter into the space and the proximity of refinement that's going to allow us to bear fruit. So how do we continue on? How do we do this? How do we learn? How do we grow? How do we have the fruits of the Spirit? What is joy possible? How do we develop this intimate connection with God where we feel like when we communicate to Him, we're not just talking to this God who's removed, or talking to a brick wall, or talking to a set of rules we never really bought into, but we're talking to a God who knows and trusts and yearns. How do we do that? We do that by abiding in Him. And that's a choice that you and I make daily. This is why David in Psalm 84, Shane mentioned it earlier when he was transitioning. David in Psalm 84, he says, better is one day in your house than 1,000 elsewhere. David turned this relationship into an abiding relationship, and he says, I would rather be a doorkeeper in your house, this very menial entry-level position. I would rather remain and stay there than do anything else. What the abiding turned into a yearning, and that yearning turned into a habit where he learned and decided, I am going to stay in this place because it is far better than anything else that I can experience elsewhere. So I'm going to ask you again. Where are you choosing to abide? I know there's some nuances with the language, but do you find yourself following at a distance? Just merely watching all of these things taking place, right? Watching different things happen? Are you merely participating at the sidelines to say, well, I have a lot of the tools, but it doesn't mean that it's functionally doing anything? Where do you find yourself this morning? And I ask that not to create a chasm or not to further this idea that you feel distance and you don't understand why. I do this to highlight the continuing invitation that Jesus offers us. To say, hey, listen, I know I'm not going to physically be here with you anymore, but I still want you to remain in me. I know things are changing and I know they're not going to look the same, but I want you to remain in me. I want you to move beyond just having the tools and not using them. I want you to walk deeply in this relationship and in this sphere with me. This is what we talked about last week with being yoked with Jesus, right? That following him is different than being yoked to him. That I can follow at a distance, I can see all these things, I cannot participate, but when I choose to be yoked or to abide in Jesus, I am saying, you are the one who's leading the way. You are the one that's going to keep me anchored. You are the one that's going to set the pace. You are the one that's going to do all of this. And I continue to choose you. John 15, verse 15. Says, I don't call you just servants anymore. You're not somebody who's just following me. You're not somebody who's just getting me meals. You're not somebody who just kind of, like this menial intern that just hopes that if they keep their head down enough, you'll make it one day. Says, I no longer call you servants because a servant doesn't know his master's business. Instead, I'm going to call you friends. Because everything that I've learned from my Father, I've made accessible to you. You didn't choose me. But I chose you. And I appointed or I called or I challenged you to go and bear fruit. Fruit that lasts. I want you to have and produce things in your life and in this world that are of eternal value. That don't fade away, that don't change just because circumstances changes, that don't change because it's not trending or popular anymore. My Father is going to give you whatever you ask in my name. This commandment I'm going to give to you the second time in the chapter. Love one another. Can you imagine the intimacy? Have you ever been in a relationship where you know what the other person is thinking or needing without them saying a word? And it's beautiful when it works together like this well-orchestrated event, right? Jesus chose us. In a manner of speaking, he saw something valuable enough in every single one of us. Something that was worth energy, time, resources, something that was worth him facing the cross. I was pointing there because the cross used to be there, but it's behind the door, so just imagine a cross right there. He says, the gardener has created you. You have gifts. You have all these amazing things to offer the world. And I chose to be obedient to my Father's mission so that none of you, none of his sheep, would risk not knowing how valuable they are. Would risk a single day questioning their importance or their value or their calling. You're worth that to me. And you're not just something I came to earth and I just kind of had to do. I wasn't just sent on a task by my Father. I chose to do this. And you're more than servants. You're more than just a group of people that's supposed to live this high moral and ethical life. It's beyond Sundays. It's beyond devotional time. Because your worth and value isn't tied to that. And what I want you to do is go out into this world and do amazing things that only you can do. And I want you to do that while you remain in me. Abide. Stay. Continue in me. Even though things look different, or they don't remain the same. Because when you abide in him, it's a lot easier to love other people. When you abide in him, it's a lot easier to look in the mirror and see the things that are true about yourself, rather than this narrative that's just been playing with a highlight reel of all your mistakes and all your failures and all the things that you were never good at. He invites us to choose to do that. To move from this relationship of approximation to this relationship of intimacy. To be able to be on the same page enough to say, you know what? There's no distance between my desires and your desires. But the question still remains. Will you choose to abide and be yoked to him? Because when we do, he says, joy that is complete is now yours. We were talking this morning about chasing things that almost work. Filling our lives with things that tickle but never really satisfy. Jesus says, if you abide in me, you're going to have joy and it's going to be complete and there's not going to be anything lacking whatsoever. Your purpose, your drive, your prayers, all those things, when you abide in me, are going to be different. Choice is ours. Will you pray with me this morning? Father, honestly, there's lots of things that we can choose to abide in. Things that partially satisfy, things that almost work, things that make us able just to get through one more day. Father, I ask that for every person that hears these words, digitally or physically, help us to choose to remain and stay and abide in you. That we wouldn't just look at these things or have this relationship from the sidelines or kind of a distance, that we would choose to have this deep and intimate relationship with you. Help us each, no matter where we are in our journey, no matter what step we need to take today. Father, I pray that through the power of your Spirit and through your word and through this community that's gathered, that you would help us to be able to take that next step. And that, Father, as we do take that next step, as we move closer to you, as we grow in you, Father, I pray that joy and peace and purpose and all of these other things that you have shown us and that you have commanded us and that you have given us in part, Father, I pray that those would become fully in our hearts, that those would become real and palatable. That the gifts you have given us to use would become reality, and it wouldn't just be this thing that we hear about or talk about or see from the sidelines and hope it would be us, but that we could actually functionally do this in our lives. So, Father, help us, no matter where we're starting, to continue to abide in you. We ask this all in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.